For 10 years, Officer Richard Lawson patrolled the streets of Riverside with an air of unchecked authority, his badge acting as both his weapon and his shield. He wasn't just any officer. He was the kind who believed his uniform granted him the right to dictate who belonged and who didn't. It wasn't about law enforcement. It was about control. Lawson had built a reputation, but not the kind an officer should be proud of. If you were black and driving through town, chances were high he'd find a reason to follow you. If you owned a small business in the wrong neighborhood, you'd see his squad car parked outside, an unspoken warning that your presence was being monitored. And if you dared to question him, well, that's where his reports came in, meticulously worded, legally airtight, always just vague enough to justify his actions. Subject exhibited suspicious behavior. Officer feared for safety. The same lines, over and over, protecting him from scrutiny. People whispered about Lawson in break rooms and barbershops. They shared stories of his intimidation, the stops that never made sense, the arrests that felt more like personal vendettas than law enforcement. But the whispers never made it past closed doors, because speaking out against a cop like Lawson came with consequences. He had friends in high places, a record of solid numbers, and a smirk that told everyone he knew how untouchable he was. That smirk, that smug, self-satisfied grin, was the last thing many saw before being handcuffed and humiliated. Like the time he stopped Eric Bennett, a high school teacher, for looking out of place while jogging in his own neighborhood. Or when he detained Margaret Liu, an elderly Asian woman, because she took too long to cross the street. Every time he got away with it, Lawson grew bolder. He walked through the precinct with his chest puffed, his badge gleaming under fluorescent lights, a silent challenge to anyone who dared question his authority. But here's the thing about men like Lawson. They start believing their own lies. They convince themselves they are untouchable. And that's precisely when life steps in with a lesson they can't ignore. For Lawson, that lesson came the day he pulled over the wrong car. The day he met Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Hayes. She wasn't just another driver. She wasn't someone he could intimidate with empty accusations. She was a soldier, a strategist, a woman who had spent 2 decades teaching others how to uphold justice with integrity. Lawson didn't know it yet, but the kingdom of unchecked power he had built over the years was about to come crashing down. Because karma doesn't care about a badge. And Victoria Hayes? She was about to show him exactly what accountability looked like. The hearing room was silent, heavy with unspoken tension. Officer Richard Lawson sat at the defense table, his once proud uniform wrinkled, his usual smirk absent. For years he had walked these halls with an air of untouchable authority, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his power unquestioned. But today, there was no confidence in his posture, no arrogance in his eyes, only fear. Across the room, Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Hayes sat upright, her presence commanding without needing a word. Unlike Lawson, she wore her uniform with honor, every medal pinned to her chest a testament to years of service and sacrifice. But she wasn't here to boast. She was here for accountability. "Officer Lawson," the review board chairman began, flipping through a thick folder of reports, complaints, and documented evidence. "Before we proceed, I suggest you watch this." The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. Dashcam footage from multiple stops, his stops, played in damning succession. His voice filled the room, the same lines he had used for years to justify his abuse of power. Subject exhibited suspicious behavior. "I feared for my safety." This was a routine stop. Each clip was another nail in his coffin. Each pause in the video, a moment where the weight of his actions became undeniable. The board members took notes. The officers in the back of the room shifted uncomfortably. Lawson's own lawyer clenched his jaw, seeing the case unravel before him. "Stop the video," the lawyer finally blurted, but it was too late. The damage was done. Victoria watched as Lawson's hands curled into fists, his breathing shallow. He had spent years making others feel small, feel powerless. Now he was the one cornered. The chairman turned to Victoria. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, you may proceed with your statement." She stood, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about one officer abusing his power. This is about a system that enabled him. Every time a complaint was ignored, every time a report was buried, he grew bolder. And today we are here because enough is enough." Lawson scoffed, trying to regain some control. "I was just doing my job." Victoria met his eyes. "No, officer, you were doing exactly what you wanted to do. There's a difference." The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the final blow. Sergeant Daniel Cortez stepped forward, holding a worn notebook. "For 3 years, I documented Lawson's misconduct," he said. "I was afraid to speak up, but today I choose to stand for what's right." And then his own daughter walked in, Rookie Officer Isabel Lawson. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I became a cop to protect people. What you did, it was wrong." Richard Lawson felt the world close in around him. His empire of fear, built over a decade, had crumbled in 3 days. And for the first time, he understood what real consequences felt like. A year had passed since Officer Richard Lawson lost everything. The man who once strutted through the Riverside precinct with unchecked arrogance was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Word had it that he worked night shifts as a mall security guard, the same kind of powerless figure he used to mock. No badge, no sirens, no authority, just a flashlight and a clipboard, watching over a parking lot that didn't care who he used to be. And yet Lawson was the least important part of this story. Because what mattered most wasn't his downfall, it was what came after. Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Hayes stood at the front of a packed auditorium, scanning the room filled with fresh police recruits. They were young, eager, uncertain. Some of them had probably heard her name before, whispered in precincts and training academies attached to the scandal that shook Riverside's law enforcement. She took a breath, then spoke. "Some of you might think I'm here because I hate the police," she began. "I don't." The room was still. "I respect the badge," she continued, "but only when it's worn with integrity. And if you take nothing else from this training, remember this. A badge is not a shield from consequences. It is a symbol of responsibility." She could see the shift in their faces, the realization that this wasn't just another lecture on protocol. That's what justice looks like. And then she smiled, not in victory, but in hope. Because real justice wasn't just punishing one corrupt officer, it was ensuring the next generation did better. And this was just the beginning. Justice isn't always about the loudest voice. Sometimes it's about the quiet work, the meticulous gathering of evidence, the slow but steady dismantling of power, the unshakable belief that truth will eventually. Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Dawson knew this better than anyone. She had spent 20 years serving her country, leading troops, training military police, ensuring that the rules meant something. She had seen war, had made life or meth decisions, had stood in front of young soldiers and taught them about honor, discipline, and responsibility. And yet, despite all that, despite the medals, despite the years of sacrifice, one man with a badge thought he could break her with nothing more than arrogance and a set of handcuffs. She remembered the feeling of cold steel around her wrists. She remembered the smirk on Officer Jonathan Reeves' face. She remembered the way he whispered, "Not so high and mighty now, are we, Colonel?" But what Reeves never understood was that Rachel Dawson had never been small, and she would never be silenced. She had fought battles far greater than a corrupt cop with an inflated ego. And so, when she sat in that cold police station, wrists bruised from unnecessary force, she did what she had always done. She took in everything. She memorized every violation. She documented every moment. And then she fought back, not with anger, not with rage, but with proof. Because Rachel knew that justice wasn't just about punishing one bad cop. It was about tearing down the system that allowed him to exist in the first place. So she built her case, brick by brick, witness by witness. She found the victims, the teacher, the elderly woman, the countless others who had once felt powerless against Reeves' authority. She found the officers who had watched in silence for years, ashamed but too afraid to speak. She gathered every report, every buried complaint, every piece of footage he thought had disappeared. And when the day came when Reeves sat in that hearing room, no longer the untouchable figure he once believed himself to be, Rachel did not gloat. She did not need to. Because justice doesn't need to shout. It simply stands. And on that day, Rachel Dawson stood for every person who had ever been silenced, every person who had ever been told that their words would never be enough. Reeves lost his badge, his power, his ability to hurt anyone else, and the system that had protected him for so long, it began to change. Because Rachel Dawson hadn't just won a battle, she had started a revolution. Justice is not just about one victory, it's about making sure no one else has to fight the same battle. Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Dawson had won. Officer Jonathan Reeves, once untouchable, had been stripped of his badge, his power, and the illusion of invincibility he had clung to for so long. The courtroom had witnessed his downfall. The evidence overwhelming, the testimonies damning, the truth undeniable. But for Rachel, justice wasn't about watching a man fall. It was about ensuring something greater rose in his place. The real victory wasn't in Reeves' termination. It wasn't in the way his former colleagues avoided his gaze, nor in the way his own daughter, a rookie officer, testified against him. No, the real victory came later, in the small, quiet changes that rippled through the system he had once manipulated. It came in the newly implemented Civilian Oversight Board, ensuring that every complaint, every voice, was finally heard. It came in the mandatory review of past cases, giving long-ignored victims a chance at the justice they had been denied. It came in the training sessions that were no longer just a formality, but a real effort to teach accountability, to foster trust between officers and the communities they served. Rachel saw the changes firsthand. One afternoon, months after the hearing, she was walking past a local coffee shop when she overheard a conversation between a young black man and a uniformed officer. "I was terrified when you pulled me over," the young man admitted. The officer nodded. "I understand. That's why I explained everything. I want you to know exactly why I stopped you, and that you are being treated fairly." Rachel paused, watching the exchange unfold. The officer wasn't defensive, he wasn't dismissive. He was accountable. And that was new. She thought back to her own traffic stop. The way Reeves had smirked, the way he had dismissed her credentials, the way he had assumed power would protect him. Now the badge no longer shielded corruption. It demanded responsibility. Rachel didn't need headlines. She didn't need recognition. She simply needed to know that her battle had meant something, that no one else would have to sit in a cold holding cell wondering if anyone would believe them. She had fought not just for herself but for every person Reeves had ever harassed, for every victim of unchecked authority, for the system that had looked the other way for too long. And as she walked away from that coffee shop, hearing the officer say, "If you ever feel mistreated, file a report. It will be heard," she knew justice wasn't just served that day. It had been rewritten. For the first time in years, the streets of Riverside felt different. Not because the city had changed overnight, but because something deeper had shifted. The understanding that power, no matter how long abused, was not above accountability. Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Dawson had seen it all. She had stood in war zones, faced enemies both foreign and domestic, and learned that true battles were not always fought with weapons. Sometimes they were fought with evidence, patience, and an unshakable will to see justice through. And now, the war she fought was over, and she had won. Officer Jonathan Reeves, the man who had believed himself invincible, was no longer a police officer. His badge, once a symbol of unchecked authority, had been revoked. His name, once spoken with fear, was now a warning. But for Rachel, the moment of victory was not in the courtroom. It was not when she watched Reeves' smirk fade under the weight of his own crimes. It was not when his fellow officers turned away, unwilling to stand beside him. Her real victory came later, in the subtle, quiet moments that proved the system was healing. It came when she walked into the newly established civilian oversight office, where a young woman sat behind a desk, reviewing complaints that would no longer be ignored. It came when she received an email from Eric Bennett, the high school teacher Reeves had once harassed, telling her that he no longer feared jogging through his own neighborhood. It came when she overheard two officers in uniform discussing a case, not how to cover for a colleague, but how to ensure justice was done. "That's not how we do things anymore," one officer had said. Anymore. That word stayed with Rachel long after she left. Because change, real change, is never loud. It does not come with banners or applause. It comes in the small shifts. The way officers conduct themselves, the way communities begin to trust again, the way justice stops being just a word and starts being a promise. She thought back to Reeves, to the man who once believed his badge made him untouchable. Now he was just another man, stripped of power, living with the consequences of his actions. Rachel didn't hate him. She didn't feel the need to revel in his downfall, because this was never about revenge. It was about every person who had once been too afraid to speak. It was about ensuring that no officer, no authority, no badge would ever go unchecked again. And as she walked down the streets of Riverside, no longer just a soldier but a symbol of accountability, she knew. This wasn't just a win, it was a beginning. Rachel Dawson had never been one to seek the spotlight. Her victories were measured not in headlines but in quiet, lasting change. She had seen corruption before, both abroad and at home. She had trained soldiers, led missions, and upheld a code of ethics that she refused to let crumble under intimidation. She had spent 20 years teaching military police how to wield power responsibly, how to recognize the fine line between authority and abuse. And yet, even with her years of experience, she had never faced an adversary quite like Officer Jonathan Reeves. He was not just a bad cop, he was a symptom of a broken system. A man who had been given power without accountability, a man who had convinced himself that his badge made him untouchable, until the day he pulled over the wrong woman, until the day his lies met evidence. Rachel didn't fight Reeves with anger. She didn't need to. She fought him the way she had been trained to fight, with strategy, with precision, with irrefutable truth. The hearing had been brutal, but it was not Rachel's words that sealed Reeves' fate. It was his own actions, played back on a screen, recorded by the very dashcams he had relied on for protection. Every fabricated report, every abuse of power, every victim he had silenced, it was all laid bare before the review board. And as the evidence stacked higher, Reeves sat powerless. His own colleagues refused to meet his eyes. His own daughter, Rookie Officer Isabel Reeves, testified against him, proving that justice was more than loyalty to a uniform. And when the board reached its verdict, termination, revocation of his law enforcement certification, and referral for criminal charges, Rachel did not smile. This was not about one man's downfall. This was about making sure no one else rose in his place. In the weeks that followed, changes rippled through the department. A civilian oversight committee was formed. Training on ethics and accountability became mandatory. Old cases, once buried, were reopened. And most importantly, complaints were finally being taken seriously. One day, as Rachel walked past the Riverside precinct, she overheard two rookie officers talking. "Did you hear about the new policy?" one asked. "Yeah," the other nodded. "We actually have to justify every stop now. Can't just pull someone over for looking suspicious." The first officer smirked. "Guess the Reeves days are over." Rachel didn't say a word. She just walked on, satisfied in a way she couldn't quite describe. Because justice doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet conversations, in the rules rewritten, in the fear replaced by trust. Sometimes justice isn't loud. It's lasting. And that's exactly the kind of victory Rachel Dawson had fought for. The power of accountability and courage. In life, we often witness injustice, whether in small acts of everyday unfairness or in larger systems that seem unchangeable. But Rachel Dawson's story teaches us that no one is truly untouchable when truth and accountability stand against them. For years, Officer Jonathan Reeves believed his badge made him immune to consequences. He relied on fear, silence, and a broken system that allowed his abuses to continue. But one person, armed with evidence, integrity, and persistence, changed everything. Rachel didn't fight with anger. She fought with wisdom, documentation, and a belief that justice, when pursued correctly, can bring lasting change. This lesson applies to all of us. Speaking up against wrongdoing, whether in our communities, workplaces, or families, takes courage, but it matters. Change may not come overnight, but when people stand together, refuse to be intimidated, and demand fairness, the system must listen. For older generations, this is especially powerful. Your voice carries experience, wisdom, and strength. Never believe that silence is the only option. When faced with injustice, stand firm, document everything, and trust that doing the right thing always leaves a mark. Sometimes quietly, but always permanently.